125. Okay. Okay. Well, yeah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So we are at ayah 125 and 126 and 127. Let's say right there. فَمَن يُرِدِ اللَّهُ أَن يَهْدِيَهُ يَشْرَحْ صَدْرَهُ لِلْإِسْلَامِ وَمَن يُرِدْ أَن يُضِلَّهُ يَجْعَلْ صَدْرَهُ ضَيِّقًا حَرَجًا كأنما يصعد في السماء كذلك يجعل الله الرجس على الذين لا يؤمنون. Let's see. So yesterday we went in lots of details about this ayah. And let's see, فَمَن يُرِدْ, and we said, is it the person willing or is it Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willing? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala already knows what you're going to will, but your will does not go outside of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will, simply because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the paradigms, created the laws. So if you decided to take the steps and take the route, for example, of piety, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had put already the paradigm that whoever follows this path will find this. So think of it as the path was already there. That's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will. The path of what is a good path and what is there and what leads to a good path, what leads to a wrong path, what leads to Jannah, which path leads to Jannah, which path leads to hellfire, which one leads to hardship, which one leads to ease, etc. So those were basically the patterns. Those were the paths that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had laid out. There's no change in those paths. It's already laid out, just like you would see, for example, the different laws on earth. You would see, well, you're going to throw an apple, it's basically going to fall. We know the gravity is there, whether you see it or not, but that's a path. Okay, that's a path. There's a paradigm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, and that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will, that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power, that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge, that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's determination of what leads to what action leads to what, and so forth. So that is what we mean by will. Now, if you do an act, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would or had already created the path and what this would lead to. So then therefore, if you were to put an investment, you were to put in an effort, you were to determine one thing, that will not go outside of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's determination. So therefore, فَمَن يُرِدِ اللَّهُ, so if you will, and if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, had already willed, يَشْرَحْ صَدَرَهُ لِلْإِسْلَامِ. So we went in details about the word يَشْرَحْ, and we said it would mean to expand, it would mean to open up, it would mean to bring about clarity, and it would mean to bring about details, or in other words, to remove any ambiguity. And that is basically what we would say al-kashf. And we went in details in regards to what that would look like, and we mentioned the interpretation for the following ayah, وَمَن يُرِدْ أَن يُضِلَّهُ يَجْعَلْ صَدْرَهُ ضَيِّقًا حَرَجًا, because that would be an antonym to it. Okay, so it would be, if it's saying, well, whoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills to open up their heart, then in contrast to that, whoever chooses the path of division, the path of delusion, the path of being astray, the path of misconceptions, then they're going to find the opposite of isharh, the opposite of clarity, the opposite of ease, the opposite of opening. So in other words, it's going to be closing. It's going to be getting tighter. It's going to be narrower. It's going to be closed. Think of it as basically the antonym to the word yashrah. So we went in details with this piece of it, and then we mentioned this hadith, although not authentic, and we said but that we can get the inspiration from this hadith, especially if it falls within the category of the non-authentic hadith, and it's called mursal. Okay, and we said mursal is when I would have the chain of narration is broken from the Sahabi side. In other words, what the Sahabi that narrated this hadith, or at least the main figures that connected to the Sahaba, are also not there. So in that situation, we would consider that that's a broken chain of narration. And we said that there are approximately 69 different categories for a non-authentic slash da'if hadith, and not every single da'if hadith we would necessarily reject it. So we would look at the reason for that, let's say, da'f, or why we put it within that classification. And then we're going to determine whether we are going to take this hadith or whether we're going to reject it. So there are many hadith, especially when we speak of good. So in other words, where there was a wave, just keep that one in mind. There was a wave within the society. They thought that they had that they had the responsibility to get people back into dhikr, back into doing what is right. So with good intentions, quote unquote, they basically started fabricating a hadith, thinking that if we can say that there is a hadith that talks about the importance of, let's say, reading Qul Huwallahu Ahad 100 times, and that you would get a plant in Jannah, or you would get anything like that, that would probably encourage the people, and they might get the habit of doing it. And they thought that was a good intention and therefore won't be held accountable. But that's not actually true. That's not true. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Man kadhaba alayya amidan muta'ammidan falyatabawwa maq'adahu min an-nar." The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever deliberately fabricates words and attributes them to me, then let them reserve a spot for them in hellfire. Nas'alullah al-afwa al-afiyah. Okay, so let's look at this one. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud basically said, does the chest actually open up or get into the expansion, etc.? And the Prophet ﷺ said, yes, light enters the heart. And he said, is there a sign to it? Is there a sign? Is there a way? What actually leads to it? All right. فَقَالَ التَّجَافِي عَنْ دَارِ الْغُرُورِ. It's basically by showing yourself away from the house of arrogance. This is talking about dunya. The house of arrogance, it's all about centricity about oneself. And that basically leads to each and every single person that is centered around themselves. One, not only be narcissists, but also consider that they are the center of truth. And number two is that they would basically start feeling that they have the right to somehow justify wronghood because it was done by them, then therefore they can justify it as well. It is a way to bend the truth in their favor because they consider themselves as the center and not the principal. Okay, al-inaba ila dar al-khulud. Al-inaba means to be obedient to the house of eternity. What are we talking about, house of eternity? We're talking about the house of al-Jannah. Jannah. Wait a minute, but hellfire is also a place of eternity. Like it's going to be forever. Right. But al-inaba ila dar al-khulud, this mainly would focus on within the context. We would also look at the Jannah as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had described it as the place of eternity. That's basically whether we're speaking about Jannah or whether we're speaking about al-akhirah. Al-akhirah in itself. Al-akhirah, that's going to be basically when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would bring death in the shape of a ram, and he would say, Ya ahl al-jannah khuludun bila maut, and he would slaughter the ram, and he would be the death would basically brought in the shape of a white big ram. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would slaughter it, and he would say, O people of Jannah, this is going to be khuludun bila maut. You're going to be living there eternally. There's no death. And the same thing for the people of hellfire. So if we were to say al-inaba, That would be basically mean to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and basically be obedient for the cause of that day of eternity, which is Yawm al-Qiyamah. So in other words, we would have the cause. It's not that I'm just obedient just for the sake of being obedient alone, but for the sake of recognizing that there is a bigger purpose than this short dunya. So al-inaba ila dar al-khulud. So let's say, Khasatullah saying, so three things: leaving arrogance, remembering death, okay, and preparing for life after death. So remembering, when we say remembering death, al-istidad, it's not remembering per se, because al-istidad is preparing for death before death happens. So what do we mean by preparing? What are you really preparing? Well, you're preparing for, number one, when that moment happens, that all the potentials, all the things that relate to time, and all your energy, you're basically channeling it for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what are you doing? You're channeling it for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore you are utilizing your time, your potential, your energy, all of that. You're utilizing it for that time when your time will end, your potentials will basically end, and certainly your energy will be completely terminated. That's death. So it's basically recognizing the end of these important things that you would have right now. Your time, what are you using your time for? Your energy, what are you investing in? What are you investing it to do? Is it just for the sake of this dunya, getting a degree, basically to get a good job, to get married, get kids, and basically have a job to build a house or whatever? That's somebody that is building for their dunya. But no, even when I wanted to get a job, I wanted to probably get a degree because I wanted to increase the chances of a halal job, okay, and probably halal employment. And I wanted to also be in service, let's say in service for the ummah, maybe be a doctor, maybe be an engineer, maybe be perhaps maybe nutritionist, whatever it is that I'm basically studying to benefit the ummah based on ilm. So that's one thing. And then, yes, I got a job, and the reason why I got the job is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that, or the Prophet said that the best income that you would make is basically the income that is what you would invest. In other words, it's basically what you would work in, and not people donating for you or government assistance. No, what are you making? That's what you're making, what you're generating. That's the best of income, and not the income that you might be getting free money, perhaps from the government, or probably people donating, or probably inheritance that you got. No, what did you do? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted us to continue putting in services, to continue putting in our own energy to create the difference. And of course, certainly when you get married, my intention to get married is to basically consider that the purpose is to raise good, pious kids, religious kids. So therefore, the husband or the wife that I would be choosing would be a person that considers that is their center, that is their place of purpose. So then therefore, الاستعداد للموت قبل نزول الموت. Okay, let's see. Now, when you look at ضيقا حرجا, he said that there are multiple different قراءات, or of course, we're talking about different recitations that this was recited in, and it was basically something that, of course, traces all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ, because it's a variant recitation that is متواتر. What does the word متواتر actually mean? So the word متواتر means that you had a group of Sahaba hear it from the Prophet ﷺ, and this group of Sahaba passed it on to a group of Tabi'een, and the group of Tabi'een passed it on to another group of Tabi'een, and so forth until basically got to us. So let's see. Ibn Kathir, he read it as not ضيقا, so without the shadda. Hold on, let me show you what that shadda looks like. Okay, so here we go. I want you to look at this one. Okay, this is extremely important. Let's look at this one. Okay, so the other qira'ah is without this one. And instead of a kasra, put a sukoon. ضيقا حرجا. ضيقا حرجا. Or the other qira'ah, he basically said ضيقا, and he recited it as حرجا. Let's see, right there. He said it is like ضيقا, like هينا. And he said there's another qira'ah, حرجا, not حرجا, but حرجا. Does it actually make a difference? Well, he said right there, he said, well, there's actually no difference in the meaning. But in terms of ضيقا and ضيقا, yes, it does make a slight meaning difference, because the shadda actually can mean one, where something is induced, or two, where something is repetitive, and three, when something is basically coming in a gradual process. Okay, so when you say with the shadda ضيقا, it's going to be either to say that their chests are going to be closing up either gradually. So in practice, if a person, and this is actually scientifically proven, okay, that when we already know that the higher you go into the atmosphere, the different atmospheres, the less oxygen, and then eventually once you go to the highest level within the atmosphere, that's when you basically would not have enough oxygen. That's why, the astronauts are dressed in the way that they're dressed. It's basically a whole outfit to make sure that they're getting oxygen to basically have them breathe. So when you look at this ayah, it's saying يَجْعَلْ صَدْرَهُ ضَيِّقًا حَرَجًا or حَرِجًا كَأَنَّمَا يَصَّعَّدُ فِي السَّمَاءِ. That their chest would be closing up as if they were going up into the different levels or the different levels of the atmosphere. So if we were to say ضيقا, we said that the shadda can mean that there's a gradual process. So in other words, is this, although it is speaking as a metaphor, remember this is saying كأنما, this isn't saying that this is true, okay? But this would be talking about it as a figurative statement. But scholars actually had differences of opinions in the situation when I'm seeing an ayah that is giving me this type of a simile, this type of a comparison, this type of a figurative statement that is saying it is as the person like going up the different levels of space in the sky. Okay, is that necessarily true that their chest would basically close up? So scientifically, they were capable of proving that. They were capable of proving that each and every single, space amount of distance within the space, within, of course, that there's an amount of oxygen, and then therefore at the end, it would basically become harajan or harijan. It would become so tight that the person is incapable of breathing. But I want to zoom out a little bit. When you say that not all scholars would agree that if I would have a metaphor, whether that should be true or not, I'll give you an example. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا يَقُومُونَ إِلَّا كَمَا. Here's that one. يقوم الشيطان الذي يتخبطه الشيطان من المس. The ayah says that a person that takes in interest, riba, that they would get up so excited about the number as exactly a person or similar to a person that would be pricked by shaitan. So then the question is, well, if you were to say then pricked by shaitan, is pricking and getting pricked by shaitan, is this true that this can happen? Or is this a metaphor? And when you say a metaphor, it doesn't have to be true. If I were to say, Rishma is as strong as a lion, does that mean she's literally strong as a lion? Does that mean if I were to also say, here comes a beautiful butterfly, and I was talking about khasatullah, for example, and I wasn't talking about a butterfly. There was no butterfly. I just said, here comes a butterfly, and that's basically more of a figurative thing. So I just wanted to say that she was beautiful as a butterfly, and basically there was no actual literally, no actual literal butterfly, but I was comparing her beauty to the beauty and the colors of a butterfly, and therefore the silence, the flying, etc., the beauty, all of that, comparing it to a butterfly or a flower, whatever. Okay. Does that have to be true? That's that debate between scholars. The first opinion basically said, if it is mentioned as a metaphor, whether it's a metaphor or whether it is not a metaphor, the Quran, they said, it contains nothing but sidq, nothing but truth, and therefore, even if we're using a metaphor, that's actually speaking of truth, and therefore even metaphors are to be considered as a literal interpretation as well, as a literal interpretation, for us to understand it, that that's true. So according to that opinion, the implication and basically what we get out of that opinion, so the scholars that said, well, ilmas, they said that would mean exorcism. The second opinion basically said that no, there's no exorcism. Why? They said because that ayah was talking about it from a metaphor perspective, and therefore that's not necessarily true, and not every metaphor is going to be true, because this is a way of eloquence. This is balagha. This is eloquence. This isn't necessarily to be taken literally like that. We know that in the language. And they said, and number two is that the word al-mas means to touch something and not necessarily penetrate something. And therefore, they rejected the whole idea that anything of exorcism is at all possible. But of course, this is, you could say, just an idea of when we're looking at كأنما يصعد في السماء. How do we understand it? Can we actually say that, yes, here we go, if there's a gradual process of going up into space, or if there is basically the repetition of you're going up and up and up and up and up. Okay, here's that repetition, that basically you're going to find yourself that there's going to be that tightness, exactly the kind of tightness that a person would basically start losing their ability to breathe, their ability to basically be able to live normally. So what happens is that they would feel the tightness in the chest. Okay, here's another question. Is this indicative of mental illness? Is this indicative of anxiety, depression, etc.? Yes, it is. It is basically an indicative of one of the symptoms, but not necessarily complete. So just because somebody has high blood pressure, we won't necessarily say, yeah, this person, and they basically diagnose this person as, yeah, they have high blood pressure, plus they need oxygen, plus they basically are diagnosed as the reason for that is depression. Let's just assume, okay? Is that a sign of lack of faith? and that they're living a life of dalal per se? No, it doesn't. That's not necessarily what it's indicative of. Okay. So just keep in mind that when we speak of depression, we speak of mental illness. Okay. Although definitely the society today exaggerates the who fits within that category, and certainly for the the therapy industry, we'll call it an industry, and you will see that this is becoming more of a business. Okay, so in order to get the business, you need the customers. So how do we get the customers? Well, basically increase in what defines and what would fit, what would be classified as fitting within depression and anxiety. And then each and every single one, oh, I'm actually going through depression. I'm actually going through depression. It's like, you see that there's somewhat of an agenda to actually put each and every single one. Okay, so regardless of that, is that necessarily a symptom of it? No, because is a person living dalal or not? That's something that they would have to know. But not each and every single person going through these symptoms would necessarily mark as dalal. Same thing if we were to talk about other diseases, okay? Even if we were to talk about other diseases, that's not necessarily an indicative that, yes, because you're not living your life on good terms, look at you now, you're getting cancer or probably different diseases. Let's see this question right there. So we can say this. Formula for Sharh Sadr in our expansion. Remembrance of death humbles the soul and shatters pride. Therefore, one should often remember death, forsake arrogance, and prepare for sincerity for the eternal life that awaits after death. I could not have said it better. Good job. Yes, absolutely. So but the other question comes in, since we're speaking about Sharh. I know I'm, since I saw that message, you got me on track again. That's good. Okay. When we look at Sharh, how do we get into Sharh? We get into Sharh by centering it around Tawheed. Tawheed is the key thing. It's basically connecting it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're recognizing your center. Okay. So remember, Islam is basically that foundation to have your wahi in place. Once you have your foundation in place, then all of the different data becomes to you clarified. You're capable of seeing the world from a different angle. And then the interpretation comes in to help you interpret different things, or to help you even, let's say, fit in within your life the data that you had learned from the basis of Islam. So in order to get to Sharh al-Sadr, yes, you definitely need the foundation of Islam, but that's one side, which is ilm. But the other side is discipline. The other side is, how do you practice it? Are you putting it as a tarbiyah? Are you putting it as a discipline? If yes, then you're going to start getting more of a sharh, more of a clarity, because the word sharaha means to also bring in clarity. So you're going to be getting more, you're going to be getting the clarity. You're going to be getting the opening. You're also going to be getting this expansion. Think of it as a wide range of vision. Wide range of vision. You're not going to be narrow. Not in your vision, not in your understanding, and not in your interpretation, and not in how you see the data, and certainly not in how you understand dunya. Because for a mu'min, the main thing for sharh is that I recognize that it's not just this dunya. I recognize that there is more to life than this dunya. So I basically would widen my range of vision to include al-akhir. Okay. widen my range of vision to include al-akhirah, and recognize that that's my area of focus. So what do? We widened basically our vision. We widened not only the vision, but we widened our understanding. So we widened the data now that we recognize that this life is one piece and not the entire piece. And to think of this world as your place in the center of life is basically a narrowed perspective. It's a narrowed perspective that does not recognize that there was actually a purpose that preceded your existence. So that's why you would see يَجْعَلْ صَدْرَهُ, whether a sadr were to include the heart, or whether this was to include the mind, or whether this was to include the ruh, whether it was to include the ruh. So how do we understand narrowness of mind? Their understanding of dunya is completely narrow, that they don't recognize that there's actually a purpose behind their existence, and that there's something that they would have to put in their energy, put in their time, and put in their potentials, and basically utilize that to get to why this life was even created. So in other words, you're expanding your range, you're expanding your understanding, you're using the data, you're recognizing this data, you're recognizing the tools that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you, and you're basically putting it in the right interpretation, which is that it must be for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It must be for the sake of the purpose that preceded the existence. Okay, let's continue right here. And he said the majority had actually read it as harajan and not harijan. Okay, what's the difference? So al-haraja is al-ghayda. So what do we mean al-ghayda? Al-ghayda, it's quite interesting. Let's see. And he said, right in the footnote, he said, al-ghayda is basically when you would have all these tree trunks and the branch, you've got a number of different trees basically coiled with one another in a specific spot, okay? And then you try to irrigate it, but the trunk is so coiled with another trunk, with another branch, with another, etc., that the water's not getting in. Okay, that's al-ghayda. Okay, so that's harajan? Yes, well, that's the etymology for that word. That's not what it means, but that's the etymology of what the word actually means. Okay, so then what does it actually mean? So number one is that basically the person is narrowing their perspective, they're narrowing their potentials, they're narrowing the purposes of their life. So once they narrow everything for themselves, then how does that even happen? So they basically would use their reference as their own whims. And once they use their reference as their own whims, it becomes as something that they are just using in terms of their own whims to just look for ways to maximize their dopamine, or perhaps just maximize a certain sensation of entertainment, a certain sensation of desire, fulfillment, etc. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically lets us know that you would have to recognize the reference first to widen your range. The widest range and the widest, and let's say the main center that you would get is Allahu Akbar. That's the key center. Once you get your tawheed in place, then you're going to be capable of recognizing the different data that you would see around you. And that's when you're going to be putting in basically your purpose, your potential, and certainly your energy in the right place. But if a person is narrowing their perspective, in other words, they're dependent on speculation, but dependent on culture, or dependent on their whims, then they're going to see that their understanding basically got reduced, and they had a very reductionist vision, and that became that it's just for this life, that their purpose is just this life, and then their energy, all of it, is basically invested just for this life. So even if they were to be millionaires, they were to be perhaps professors, whatever it is, if they only see out of this life really just their dunya, then that's a very reductionist vision. Let's see. Starting with takbir and ending with taslim. Starting, you mean? Starting with takbir and ending with taslim. Oh, beautiful. Yes. Girl, khasatullah, girl, you're gonna be really something. You're really gonna be something. This girl is very eloquent and very focused, mashallah. Exactly. So starting with your takbir and ending you're ending your life with taslim. What is it, taslim? Is it taslim basically to say assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah? Well, within the context of salah, yes. Takbir is Allahu Akbar, and taslim assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It can also mean taslim. Another meaning for it is to be obedient. Obedient to who? Obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you would start your life with Allahu Akbar being your center, and then taslim meaning al-khudu', meaning to submit and be obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So why is your religion based on submission and not freedom? Actually, it's based on freedom. It's telling you submit to Allah to be free from submitting to anyone else. That's what it means. That's the inference. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, submit to the Lord Almighty. That way you would be free from submitting to the culture, submitting to people's desires, submitting to wrong interpretation of dunya, or submitting to your own self and your desires. So that's what we mean by obedience to Allah. It's not that our religion is based on submission to mean that you're taught that you're supposed to be submitting in a way to not get freedom, but it's actually to get freedom from submitting to people. You submit to Allah. All right. So that's basically what it means. So khasatullah, she says, yes, and what you're saying, but we have another meaning as well. Right. All right, let's see. Ibn Abbas said, al-haraj, he said, actually is the place of where you would see trees intertwined, or at least, I guess, all curtailed to one another, or what do they call that? Multaf, meaning they're so... do they call that intertwined? Multaf actually means they're so coiled. They're coiled with one another. And what does that mean? He said, it's kind of weird that they were supposed to put a semicolon here, but okay. He said, it is as the heart of a disbeliever, they would be so coiled, that their hearts would be so coiled, just as trees would be so coiled, that no wisdom would reach their roots. What root? We're talking about the root, basically where the basis. So we're talking about metaphorically here, that their hearts would be as if it's so coiled that they're not capable of letting wisdom, letting Quran, letting hikmah, letting sunnah, letting basically the resources that are necessary for them to grow, basically reach their roots. And what root? This is metaphorical. So the root would be their qalb, their core, their heart, their spirit, their mind. It would be so coiled. Coiled, I mean, when you say so coiled, yes, this is speaking about it literally coiled, okay, at least in terms of the word haraj as an etymology. But metaphorically, This is talking about that the heart, or that the heart, the mind, the ruh, that they would be there would be all these coils around it. Coils of what? So coils of desires, coils of just different things that are distracting them. Why did you get distraction? How did you get there? You're going to see that down the road, the ayat are going to be using a word frequently, which is غافلون, that they would be in a state of ghafla. They would be in a state of ghafla that they're so distracted that they can't even recognize that there's more to life than what they are basically living for. You're going to see that there's going to be a repetition for غافلون right there. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying, well, ذَلِكَ أَن لَمْ يَكُنْ رَبُّكَ مُهْلِكَ الْقُرَى بِظُلْمٍ وَأَهْلُهَا غَافِلُونَ. So this is to basically say, well, what is actually relating and what's making these people live like that? Well, it's also clarifying that, well, they're pacified, they're focused on these trivial matters, that they don't even recognize that their purpose of life and their energy is far more valuable, far more worthy and worth than this. Yesterday I was listening to this one. He said, if you look at, I'll just say in my own words, it's quite interesting. That's what Islam also says, even though it was a non-Muslim that said it, but it would actually, you could see that the ayat are saying basically the same thing. Okay, what was it? That if a person is living their life based on a certain worth, so what does that mean? If you're willing to give up on your principle, and if I were to offer you, let's say $1 million, 2 million, 3 million, whatever it is, and you were willing to give up on a value or a principle that is important and that you consider it as a foundation, if you're willing to give up on it, that means that's your price. And once that is something that you are willing to consider as a price for you, that means you're willing to compromise on a certain principle. And not until a person lives up to considering that, no, I am very strong, I am very I'm very serious, or I'm deeply rooted in the principle, where even if any price was offered to me, no one can consider my vulnerability being money. In other words, I'm not willing to compromise my principle, not for any price. It isn't until your value is as strong and as important to you as your life, that would not necessarily be considered a principle until your life would be something that you would rather sacrifice than sacrifice your value. And that's the same thing when the Prophet ﷺ had actually said in the hadith that you would not be considered a believer until you would consider that you would hate to be thrown in hellfire as much as you would hate to leave Islam. Okay? So in other words, that not until your value and your life is considered that you would not compromise for any price or anything or any pressure, no matter what that is, even if your life was put at stake. Not only then would you be a believer, but if a person is willing to change, and that's one thing that you would see, especially during our modern times, they're willing to give up on, let's say, their hijab. Why? Because, it would reduce from my ability or probably the chances of me getting a job. Or perhaps maybe, reduce from their Islamic commitment, or they don't want to talk about it because they're afraid that that might affect their grades or credits in school or in class, etc. But a Muslim, the stronger their faith, that's when they're not willing, not for a credit and not for money and not for a job and not for a CV and not for a promotion. They're not willing to give up on their deen. Why? Because to them, that is a principle. That is worth their life. Not until then would they be considered committed to their deen, committed to their akhirah. Not until then. Even if it was life. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for jihad, even if it meant putting your life at stake, you're willing to basically sacrifice your life. If it means that, then let it be that. That's the definition of Iman. Okay, someone was actually, I believe, saying something in the chat right there. So let's see. Said one of the greatest signs of an expanded heart, sharh al-sadr, is prayer. The more the heart is expanded, the better the prayer becomes, but both outwardly and inwardly. This is my personal experience. I do agree with you that when it comes to prayer, they would basically, وَلَذِكْرُ akbar. Dhikrullah subhanahu wa ta'ala, mentioning the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, doing salah. When the person is connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they will find their peace in salah. They will find their peace in dhikr. They will find their peace in commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's deen. Let's see. روي عن عمر بن الخطاب هذا المعنى. And he said روية. And we said it in Lugha Arabiya. When you say the word ruwiya, that is indicative that this is actually not necessarily based on an authentic narration, but he also wanted to say that it's not just Ibn Abbas, but there is a non-authentic narration to support this interpretation. And remember, the scholars of usul, what is usul? Usul is different than fiqh. Okay, let me write that down really quick, okay? Pay attention to this one, okay? When I say the science of fiqh is different than usul al-fiqh, okay? The science of fiqh, you learn how to derive the rulings from the resources, okay? Usul al-fiqh, no, we're going to go even farther. We're going to look at these resources and we're going to lay out the paradigms and lay out the different rules on how you would interpret this, this resource or this reference. Okay, so what does that look like? Usul al-fiqh, a person that is specialized in usul al-fiqh, they'll basically say, okay, the references that we would go to in order to determine something is part of Islam, not part of Islam, and what Islam says, we'll basically say Quran, and then we'll tell you to go to Sunnah, then we'll tell you to go to the Ijma', and then we'll tell you go to the Qiyas and the analogy, and we then might discuss the issue about Sahaba and their opinion, the people of al-Madinah and their opinion, and their culture, and perhaps culture, urf, and perhaps al-istishab, and perhaps sadd al-dhara'i, all these different things. We'll basically study that in usul al-fiqh. Okay. The other thing an usul al-fiqh would expert would do is also not only go into the resources, but telling you, okay, if you have an imperative verb actually means giving you a command. Then therefore, as in practice, that would mean you would have to apply that in practice. Either a command to do something or a command to abstain from something. That would be a command of either wajib or either we're talking about something that is prohibited. That's an usul al-fiqh. Okay, so you definitely then need usul al-fiqh before we even study fiqh. Definitely. If you know usul al-fiqh, you have the foundations in place. Usul al-fiqh expert can be a faqih. If a person studied usul al-fiqh, they could also be a faqih. But a faqih cannot necessarily be an usuli. So think of it as the usul al-fiqh. Think of it in medicine, that would be the pathologist. Okay, that would be the pathologist. That would be, taking, what do pathologists do? Well, the pathologist, you could, as a doctor, maybe, let's say primary doctor, family doctor, whatever, okay, they'll probably maybe, get somebody, a patient, and this patient comes in and they're seeing I don't know, a little lump on their skin, and they're like, oh, this lump, looking at it, it's probably just an insect bite, or maybe fats, or whatever it is, okay? But then they'll say, we'll do a little biopsy. We'll just take a little specimen, send it to the pathologist, and those pathologists, they're going to look under the microscope and confirm my diagnose, or probably say, actually, here's what we saw under the microscope. Under the microscope, we're seeing something else. We're actually seeing 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. And then that's the pathologist. The pathologist would lay out, let's say, the actual, let's say the back end. Okay, they'll be the ones to work in the back end and say, well, here's how you can diagnose this. This is what it might look like. This is what we're seeing under a microscope, etc. That's usul al-fiqh. Usul al-fiqh is basically teaching us the pathology of how we understand and where to go to in our references to understand fiqh, to study Islamic law. If you don't study usul al-fiqh, then you're really confused in how you can study and understand the resources. Okay, this is extremely important. Okay, let's see. And there is one thing I would like to say is that in usul al-fiqh, the reason why I brought this up was because he said, روي عن عمر بن الخطاب هذا المعنى. Umar ibn al-Khattab, there was a narration of a similar interpretation. Okay. So why did I even bring up usul al-fiqh? If I were to have a hadith life and another hadith life and a third hadith life, but they all came with the same meaning or the same conclusion. I'll give you an example. Music, okay? I'm not talking about music in terms of the lyrics. The lyrics, we already know, if it contained shirk, contained kufr, all these different things contained, being descriptive about male, female, we already know that that's haram. There's no question about it, okay? But we're talking about musical instruments. We're talking about, just musical instruments, just playing musical instruments, whether I've got nature and I'm playing, I don't know, musical sounds of the flute, the clarinet, whatever it is, they've got these musical instruments in the background. Is that halal or haram? Just, that's it. Is that halal or haram? So you had 16 different hadith. 16 different hadith, which also includes a hadith that was narrated in al-Bukhari. سيأتي على أمتي زمان يستحلون الحرى والحرير والقينات والمعازف. That hadith was in al-Bukhari. But some scholars actually objected and said all the different hadith that were mentioned, all the different 16 hadith that were mentioned were actually not free of controversy on their level of authenticity. Pay attention. I'm here speaking of ilm. I'm not speaking of, somebody like, no, how dare you say that? Listen, we're speaking of ilm here, okay? Every single hadith that was mentioned in regards to music had fallen in some level of controversy. But then, can we get all these 16 ahadith even though, just like, for example, the hadith that was narrated in al-Bukhari, yes, it's narrated in al-Bukhari, but there's something called mu'allaq in al-Bukhari. What does that mean? Al-mu'allaq basically does not fall within the conditions that al-Bukhari had basically put upon himself as a classification of what makes an authentic hadith. So we've got some hadith that don't have a complete chain of narration. Yes, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani did his job and said, hey, I was capable of finding the missing links, and therefore I got you the missing links that would help us know that that hadith that we just mentioned earlier, that there's going to come a time where people from my nation would regard what was haram or what is haram, from zina to silk to music, as being halal. يستحلون. Now, can we regard that all these ahadith, even though we were not capable of proving 100% that they are authentic, but we do get one thing, is that 16 different ahadith, they are coming with an inference to say music is haram. Coming with this inference. Can I consider that bimajmu'ah, in other words, looking at this accumulative number of ahadith, even though they're not authentic, but I can come to the conclusion, even though they're all not authentic, but I can come to the conclusion with one inference that music is haram. They're teaching me one thing. They're giving me the same inference. Okay, you said they weren't all authentic. The first opinion basically considered that, yes, if you have a weak hadith and another weak hadith and a third weak hadith, in other words, they would basically fortify or would basically enforce one another to make one strong statement. That's the first opinion, to make one strong statement. Yes, they're all weak, but they're giving you one strong statement. The second opinion basically said, no, if something is weak plus a weak thing plus a weak thing, that doesn't fortify one another. Because at the end of the day, it's a weak statement, and therefore the conclusion is not going to be based on a strong evidence. It's going to be baseless. That's the second opinion. Okay, so what should I do? Should I listen to music? I was always avoiding music. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying go listen to music. I'm saying from a different end, that when we understand our Islam, we understand our resources and how we understand these resources, that we can get an inspiration. We definitely, out of all these authentic, non-authentic ahadith, the 16 ahadith, well, al-Albani basically worked on trying to prove these 16 different ahadith, okay, called it Tahrim al-Ma'azif, okay? And what we can get is that an inspiration is that definitely music, even if I don't want to say that it is haram, that music is a distraction from you putting in an investment in dhikr, that music is also something that as-salihin did not invest their energy in learning or teaching or even spending time to get entertainment in. Okay, that music is basically something that can affect a person's brain, the person's focus, the person's connection with the dhikr, etc. That's what I can get as an inspiration, at least, even if I were not to say that this is haram. That's why Shawkani
He basically said إبطال الإجماع في تحريم السماع. Basically wrote a book and he said, well, we don't actually have unanimous agreement, and that's why he labeled his book إبطال الإجماع. He said, I'm actually going to say that there is no unanimous agreement, but within his book, he also said a very strong statement. And that would conclude all of that. And he said, it may not put music within the perimeter of haram per se, but that doesn't get it within the perimeter of halal. If it doesn't put it within the perimeter of haram, it doesn't mean it stays halal. It just means we've got very strong resources, or at least very many resources, not necessarily strong, but we could see that we've got enough resources to tell me that this affects your sharh al-sadr. This affects your heart from being connected to dhikr. That's basically what it is. I could see someone has their hand risen and then it went down. Okay, let's continue right there. ذكره مكي. Okay, let's see. مكانا حرجا or حرجا الجوهري. By the way, الجوهري, you guys, guess what? الجوهري, we talked about him before. He's a scholar in Lugha Arabiya. That's how he died. Basically started getting psychosis, telling him that if he were to jump off the cliff that he would be safe. That's what he did. He jumped from a high cliff thinking that he would be somehow safe. The psychosis was so strong. Must have been, who knows? Is it going to be schizophrenia or what is it? But he was getting this very strong psychosis that was affecting his sanity. Yes, even if it's a alim like that, right? Okay, let's see. He said, when you look at haraj or haraj, just basically coming from the etymology, telling us that this is talking about a lot of trees that whatever you're trying to irrigate is not even getting to the root. So basically coming in with the same inference, coming in with the same meaning. Okay. الحرج, and he said ضيقا حرجا. He said what the Qurtubi basically said الحرج ضيقا حرجا is also referring and giving me the inference of sin. So why did their hearts get narrow? It was an implication of sin, basically coming in to block their ability from absorbing and from having sharh al-sadr and from absorbing the ilm, the hikmah that surrounds them, etc. So sin would act as an obstacle. So where's that coming from? So here's another meaning. You said il-haraj, it's basically the wood when it would support itself. And in other words, we're creating, when you're putting a number of different logs, or you're probably, connecting the wood in a tight way. And he said that that's what the dead people are carried on. So they basically, bring in different pieces of, well, what do they call that? It's wood, but we're talking about maybe long branches, and then they would connect them to one another, and then they would tighten it using another branch or using another plant to tighten all the branches together. So that's basically another haraj. That also means haraj. Okay, so regardless, at the end of the day, we recognize that il-haraj, whether we're speaking about something causing that tightness or whether we're speaking about something that coils and prevents the hikmah, the Quran, the light from penetrating the heart, or whether we're speaking about sin as an obstacle to basically pacify the person from thinking about the resource, whether we're speaking about tawheed, or whether we're speaking about the purpose that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told us about dunya, akhirah, or whether we're speaking about the expansion of vision and recognizing the meaning of life and what that actually what that actually means in regards to the purpose, and in regards to putting in their energy, putting in their effort, putting in, certainly we're speaking about what are you investing in. So what is that person investing in? كأنما يصعد في السماء. Another قراءة. Remember, Ibn Kathir had already recited that يجعل ضيقا. So that was another قراءة for Ibn Kathir. And now we've got another قراءة for Ibn Kathir. And he read it as يصعد في السماء. Okay, hold on. So do that again. So in his first قراءة, he basically said, for this one, ضيقا. For the other قراءة, including in that, with Ibn Kathir as well, كأنما يصعد في السماء, not يصعد. So in both situations, he took out the shadda. And you said the meaning of shadda is to mean what? One, can mean a gradual thing. Two, it can mean a confirmation of something. Three, it can mean a repetition. Okay, that's basically what a shadda would usually mean. So here, كأنما يصعد في السماء would basically mean as if the person is going up, but not in a repetitive manner, because يصعد would mean we've got going up and up and up and up. That's what the shadda would mean. Okay, but يصعد, just going up. Okay, at the end, it basically comes with the same conclusion, that it gave us, of course, the comparison of a kafir that is going and being distant away from faith, that they would be so heavy and feel that every single commitment is just a burden. You say, for example, salah. Oh man, that's too much. What do you mean 5 times? Fajr. Oh, it's so hard for me to get up at that time. I can't be committed to getting up at that time. Hijab. Oh, it's too hot. It's too much for me to bear. What are people going to say to me? And it's probably going to affect my ability to maintain a job, and etc. What do we got? We've got a person that basically is not putting in the same amount of commitment. So they would fear. كأنما يصعد في السماء. It's like, oh, that's too much. That's too much. I can't handle it. I can't handle it. So that's كأنما يصعد في السماء, and therefore they would then be complaining about the amount of a burden, the amount of hardship, and how it's making their life too tight. So if you were to say, stop riba, oh, that means I basically cannot buy a house through the bank. And, I don't want to live in a place that is small, etc. They'll find basically a reason that that shaitan would beautify it for them, to give them that narrative that you need this so bad. Yeah, your house is too small on you. This country that you going to a Muslim country. Oh, their infrastructure is horrible. Why would you want to go to a Muslim country? The infrastructure is horrible. Everything is basically no. But if you are living in a Western country, you would get good health care. There's better respect. Very available dunya. And yeah, why would you want to go to a Muslim country? And it basically would be given to you in a narrow perspective. Everything is going to come as, no, that's too hard. I can't handle it. I don't want to do this. And that's ضيقا حرجا كأنما يصعد في السماء. All right. And of course, the majority had read it in without an alif. What are we talking about here? يصعد قرأ الباقون بالتشديد من غير ألف. I got lost myself. Okay. So يصعد meaning, okay. So not يصعد, but يصعد. Okay. So at the end, يتجرع يتفرق, similar to يتجرع يتفرق. What is يتجرع? يتجرع means to swallow something. يتفرق means to disseminate, split. Okay, that's يتجرع يتفرق. So what happens? Do their chest basically get into this moment of as if they're swallowing something? It's so tight that they can't even swallow it, and they would be finding it so hard to absorb their religion, that they would basically feel like a person, when you hate something and they're asking you to swallow it and you're like, you're trying to swallow it, but then it comes out on its own because your body is just rejecting it. That's basically similar to yasad. They're trying to put it in, but then they're trying to spit it out and basically can't handle it and can't even swallow it. Okay, so that's similar to the kafir, or perhaps the munafiq as well. Whenever they would be given let's say a commitment or something in the religion, they're taking that time. It's like, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do that. The more committed the person is to Tawheed, they'll find that trade-off of dunya, trading dunya for akhirah, is easier. Because they're so focused on akhirah. If it means to give up on my house, my car, my ease of life, perhaps my jewelry, whatever it is, for the sake of akhirah, here it is. That's a stronger believer. Here it is. My comfort, there's no way that you can get to, remember the Prophet ﷺ in the hadith, that if a person is amin fi dunya, then they won't be amin fil akhirah. If they're feeling the comfort in this dunya and feeling that I'm relaxed, then they won't be relaxed and safe in al akhirah. But if they feel that, I have to give up on my dunya for the sake of akhirah, that's when they will be the ones to be safe and comfortable in the akhirah. Okay, let's see. And it was also said, كاد قلبه يصعد إلى السماء نبوا عن الإسلام, that their hearts would, as if basically their hearts would be as if they are going up into the different levels of the skies and atmospheres, as if they were going up in the skies, basically wanting to reject Islam. They're running away from it. كذلك يجعل الله الرجس عليهم. What is a rijs? A rijs basically is from a natn. What is a natn? Something that has a strong odor, smell. So that's the etymology of it. The other interpretation is that it's a rijs. كذلك يجعل الله الرجس is the punishment or the torments. Rijs, according to Ibn Abbas, basically means shaitan, that he would basically be the one to control them. Wait, so does he actually control people? He doesn't control you. What's the evidence? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually tells us that shaitan, on the wording and what the shaitan would say, ما كان لي عليكم من سلطان إلا أن دعوتكم فاستجبتم لي. I had no power over you. I just spewed different things in your ears. I communicated things to you. I basically passed on that type of delusion onto you, and you absorbed it. You took it. You believed it. That's all. I didn't have the power to control you. Of course, Shaitan said that in order to basically say he wasn't accountable for it, and that you cannot say that Shaitan is responsible for it. So here, when you look at يسلطه عليهم, that Shaitan would become the one to overcome them. Like overcome, like in power? No, he doesn't he cannot, many times people would think that in exorcism that the Shaitan can actually control a person's actions and decision making. No, Shaitan cannot do that. Shaitan cannot control your decision making whatsoever. You are the one. The Shaitan can, though, for the scholars that said that exorcism can happen, they did say that Shaitan or jinn may have a strong grip on the person to basically reduce their effort in controlling themselves. They wanted to do dhikr, but they'll get them into a severe headache. Okay, they'll probably affect their ability and basically make that tightness that affects their ability to read, let's say, ma'awidat, okay, for example, okay? But shaitan doesn't have the power to make you do zina or drink or whatever it is. Shaitan does not have that power. That is the person himself or herself basically deciding to do that. The shaitan can never tell you, or at least force you, to do a major sin. That was your decision. But you succumbed to the whisper of shaitan. You accepted it, you absorbed it, and the shaitan basically had overcome your rejection, because you weren't rejecting in determination. You weren't consistent. So basically had power over you each and every single time he would spew an idea, spew a certain thing, and then you would absorb it, you would accept it, you would do it. Okay? So that's a rijs. So so you would say in Tafseer that sometimes they may speak about it as basically going back to the etymology of that meaning, and sometimes they'll talk about what this results into. That's why they said torment, and sometimes they'll go into a more specific detail and say, well, this is actually referring to shaitan. So rijs is anything that there's no good in it. Anything that's not good, whether we're speaking about a contaminant or whether we're speaking about perhaps we know that the things that are not good, they either have a foul smell or they may have a foul taste. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically designed a world for us to let us know that something is not good for you by smelling, knowing that there's a smell. You know, the food would go wrong and your brain is capable of just smelling the food and just smelling the meat or whatever it is. And you're like, it doesn't smell right. And that's one way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had put in something like a built-in examiner, like a built-in scanner to help you recognize what's good and what's bad. And that's one thing. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you al-fitra, a built-in scanner, a built-in detector to help you recognize what's good and what's bad. But this detector, this scanner can go wrong. It can malfunction. Fitra, that is, can malfunction. How can it malfunction? It can malfunction by giving it basically the exposure that it starts out with the exposure. If a person drinks frequently, they won't even recognize the foul smell of alcohol. They won't even recognize it. They won't even recognize the taste and the bitter taste or whatever it is. They'll stop recognizing it. They'll basically become so numb to the smell, so numb to the taste, that they will only get to see it from the lens of, I guess, getting them high or getting them into some form of entertainment and what they would get through that. Okay. And of course, subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lets us know that sin and ghafla. What's the difference between sin and ghafla? Sin is an action that a person might do that goes against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's principle. Ghafla is the implication of sin. The implication of sin, it can affect the person's mindset. In other words, they'll be so hooked onto seeing and fixated on the entertainment or probably the pleasureful feeling that they might be getting out of sin, that they'll forget, or they'll be so pacified from getting a wider range in their vision and actually see the implication it will have on their heart, on their blood, on their body, on their deen, on their future, on their family, or whatever it is. So that's al-ghafla. Al-ghafla is looking at it from the implication of what happens to their mind, what happens to their range of vision, what happens to their recognition of purpose. That's al-ghafla. They're just so fixated on that entertainment or fixated perhaps on that desire that they don't even see a wider range of where and what this would actually mean. Okay, let's see. وَهَذَا صِرَاطُ رَبِّكَ مُسْتَقِيمًا. Oh, wait a minute. So I was supposed to give the meaning. كَذَلِكَ يَجْعَلُ اللَّهُ الرِّجْسَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ. That is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will have a rijs upon the disbelievers. Okay, so what do you get out of كَذَلِك? كَذَلِك, you get out of it that there's a paradigm. Okay, so is this talking about كَذَلِك to mean this ism al-ishara, that there's a paradigm, that's how it works? In other words, there's a certain, okay, so if you were to say rijs, is this talking about an inclusive al or a specifying al? Is this al-ahdiyya or is this al-istighraqiyya? Okay, now, if you were to say this is a specifying al, then you would be talking about going back to the beginning of the sentence. So if a person stays away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, i.e. stays away from Tawheed, then they basically had stayed away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the rijs then, if it were to mean a specific thing, so in other words, whoever is not included in sharh al-sadr, then they are basically having this contamination. Then that means that their hearts are, their body, their mind, their soul is contaminated with a rijs. Whether we're speaking about seeing the implication in behavior, or whether we're seeing a psychological effect, or whether we're seeing physical effect, or whether we're seeing a life and the purpose and what they're living their life for as being the effect. So rijs, yes, it means contamination, but it also can mean that it will have an effect on all different corners of their life if they were distant away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right, that's what rijs would mean. So when we say كَذَلِكَ يَجْعَلُ اللَّهُ الرِّجْسَ, so what if we were to say rijs is more of that al is an inclusive al. It's a wider thing. So that would include not only Tawheed per se, but that would include all the different areas and all the different corners of Islam. So what would be the evidence to prove if you wanted to say that that was an inclusive al? Well, right there, we continue the ayah and it says, وَهَذَا صِرَاطُ رَبِّكَ مُسْتَقِيمًا. And this is the path to your Lord Almighty that is a straight path. So if you say rijs to mean inclusive, that would basically be هذا and كذلك would basically refer to Tawheed. Okay, so كذلك, that would be Tawheed, that would be the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that would be all the details of Islam, etc. And that would be what would lead to Suratu Rabbika Mustaqima. That would lead to the straight path of your Lord Almighty. And the evidence to prove to those that this is referring to an inclusive, قَدْ فَصَّلْنَا الْآيَةِ. We had given you all the different details. So what details? Details on Tawheed, or details on how to apply Sirat al-Mustaqim, how to apply the straight path, how to be on the straight path. Legislature, آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات. So لقوم يذكرون. What's the opposite? يذكرون, يغفلون. The opposite, يذكر, can mean, well, the root is ذكر. That's the root, ذكر. And we said the root ذكر can mean to remember, could also mean to repeat, could also mean to say. Let's write that down. To repeat, this is important, okay? So ذكر, repeat, say or utter, okay? And ذكر, remember, okay? Let's see. So how is that related to anything? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically letting us know that the way that these people basically got so sold their hearts basically so coiled, and that any irrigation would not reach their soul, not reach their heart, would not reach their mind, because their hearts are so coiled, and they would find this stress on their heart. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, you know, they're basically living in a rijs. They're living a life of rijs, a life of this one from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How do we get that out? That's why he said, صِرَاطُ رَبِّكَ مُسْتَقِيمًا لِقَوْمٍ يَذَّكَّرُونَ. How do we not get into this rijs? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, okay, well, here's the answer. To not get into this rijs, to not get into this result. So the rijs would basically be, you know, in the pathology would be basically the root cause. Okay. And of course, the symptom would be this. This is the symptom. Okay. What was the action that they had done? Was basically dalal. Okay. So now we got the diagnose. Now we got pathologists would basically say, okay, this is rijs. And then we've got the lifestyle and what we see this person living in. In other words, the dynamic of how this diagnosis or these symptoms, okay, and what we're seeing in action is that you would see a person living in dalal. Okay, so how do we cure all of this? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, very simple. هذا صراط ربك المستقيم. There's a path to the Lord Almighty. It's a straight path. It's going to basically, one, take out all these coils that are coiled around your heart. You've got a number of different details. You've got different details, and that's to help you what? But these details, you won't be capable of removing all these coils, removing all these different things that are acting as an obstacle from you absorbing al-hikmah, absorbing al-ilm, absorbing, etc., until لِقَوْمِ يَذَّكَّرُ. What should I do then? Well, we need an amount of commitment. We need you to repeat something. We need you to be consistent in dhikr. We need you to do this frequently. It's not enough to just do it once. It needs to be frequent. Number two, we need you to say it. Why? Once you say it, it basically goes from words of mouth to later also vibrating in your heart and vibrating in your mind and vibrating in your soul. That's how it will then affect your remembrance. It will affect you from being in a state of ghafla to being in a state of recognition. You remember something, you recognize it. Why remember? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had already wired your brain with fitrah. He already wired your brain in tawheed. But this rewiring can sometimes lose this energy in it, can sometimes lose this power that it basically makes it turn, that basically turns it on, or basically gives it the power to basically do and function. So what you need to do is that you need to put in a number of different repetitive behaviors. You're going to pray salah repeatedly. You're going to do siyam at once a year, basically within a whole month. And you're going to do, there are certain actions, but that's not enough to just say on a word of mouth. But we need you to do repeated action, because dhikr is not just words to say. It's not subhanallah alhamdulillah alone. That's one side of dhikr, but there's another side of dhikr, basically dhikr to say There's oral dhikr, there's visual dhikr. يتفكرون في خلق السماوات والأرض ربنا ما خلقت هذا باطلا سبحانك. And there's behavioral dhikr. You need to put in a certain discipline. If you don't put in that discipline, you're going to find yourself in a state of ghafla. So in order to take away that ghafla, to remind you and to basically, let's say, get in those wires that you were wired in your fitrah, basically functioning again and getting that energy and consider it as the power in it again, you would basically need to put in a number of different energy. Think of your behavior is going to be the repeated behavior that you would do, and simply the different dhikr that you would do. That's basically going to bring in the energy to your mind. Your mind will be capable of recognizing your mind will basically give in the recognition from mind to later on affect your heart, your chest, and later on affecting your soul. So you would basically have to do a number of different stages. Your body is going to affect how your mind recalls things and how your heart stores that information and how your soul would lighten with this sharh al-sadr. So what do they get? لهم دار السلام عند ربهم. What would they get? They would get دار السلام. They would get the house of peace. Why the house of peace? Because they seeked peace. They seeked inner peace. They seeked outer peace. They were all along basically working towards getting that inner and external peace. So therefore, they would deserve the house of peace, and where? Near their Lord Almighty. Near their Lord Almighty. Why? Because huwa waliyuhum. Because they were taking the Lord Almighty as their wali, as their authority, as the one that they would turn to. So that's why when we said right there, what is this really talking about? وَهُوَ وَلِيُّهُمْ. This is to basically mean tawheed. بِمَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. Their actions, what determined what actions they would do and what they considered as right, wrong, etc. What determined that was basically tawheed, was basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's how they related that. They related it to going back to tawheed. All right. So this is it. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all Darus Salam, give us Sharh al-Sadr, make us from those that would follow Siratu Rabbina Mustaqima, and make us from those that would be لِقَوْمِ يَذَّكَّرُونَ, as the qawm that would be يَذَّكَّرُونَ, and make us from those that would have Sharh al-Sadr for Islam and for Iman. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت. I know that was a lot that I had said today. I know it's a lot of information. Right, it's controlling the mind through behavior. Absolutely. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. I know it was a lot. It was plenty of information, and we got into usul al-fiqh, we got into tazkiyah, we got into tafseer, we got into lugha arabiya, all those areas. I know it's a lot to basically focus on. So I know that anybody that attends the classes, like, they have to be totally awake because I know sometimes I'm hard to follow along. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to listen to it. Or even a comment, or maybe you have something that you would like to share that I probably missed out on. No one wants to say anything. Okay, they don't want to be on YouTube. That's okay too. Let me right there.